In the stillness of early spring 1976, a new groundskeeper at the Our Lady of Mercy Convent in eastern Iowa uncovered an anomaly in the property's irrigation system, a capped-off pipe that led nowhere and carried no water. What began as a mundane maintenance puzzle soon unraveled into a quiet dread among the remaining sisters. For over a decade, a slow attrition had haunted the convent. 14 women, all professed nuns, had left no trace. No official investigations, no media alerts. The records insisted they'd transferred or departed voluntarily. Yet none had written, none had returned. This is the account of what was lost behind stone walls and why the silence was so thoroughly preserved. The Our Lady of Mercy Convent was known in the region as a quiet retreat for elderly religious women and novices undergoing spiritual formation. Located on a secluded acreage near the Mississippi River, the convent's Gothic facade, built in 1893, stood in picturesque isolation. Locals knew little about its operations, and most were content with that. The sisters operated a small textile workshop and hosted an annual candlelight vigil each September. From the outside, the convent appeared serene and devout, an ideal symbol of order, humility, and sanctuary. What the Diocese of Davenport presented to the public was a narrative of grace and endurance. But internally, something had gone very wrong. Between 1965 and 1976, a quiet series of internal departures, misfiled reports, and dead-end inquiries concealed a growing list of unexplained absences. No alarm was ever sounded. No closure was offered. 14 nuns had vanished. The official archival materials for the Our Lady of Mercy Convent are at first glance meticulously organized. Photographs line the halls of its administrative annex, each dated, each bearing captions in soft, looping cursive. The early years after its 1893 founding were modest. A few dozen women, largely of German and Irish heritage, dedicated to the service of the poor and the spiritual education of girls in the rural Midwest. The convent had no school of its own, but it supplied teaching sisters to various parochial institutions throughout Iowa and northern Missouri. By 1948, following the post-war expansion of the Catholic Church's influence in rural America, the convent was classified as a semi-enclosed facility. This meant its members took traditional vows but were not cloistered. They could engage with the outside world under controlled circumstances. This hybrid model was especially attractive to older sisters returning from missions or facing declining health, and to younger women unsure if they would take final vows. Our Lady of Mercy became, effectively, a holding place, a contemplative transition zone. Diocesan documents from 1951 describe it as ideal for vocational discernment and end-of-life care. Its medical wing, constructed in 1959 with funding from a donor estate, housed 18 private rooms and a small chapel. Internally, the space was known simply as Lower East. Staffing was minimal. 2 part-time physicians from nearby Keokuk made monthly visits, and the rest was managed by resident sisters with prior experience in nursing or domestic care. For decades, the arrangement appeared to function quietly. No licensing issues. No inspections failed, but those records also reveal an unusual turnover rate beginning in 1963. The convent's official communication style mirrored that of the diocese: deferential, passive, and procedural. Sisters who departed were often listed as relocated to mother house, returned to family, or transitioned to lay state. Most of these phrases, when investigated later, proved vague or unverifiable, especially in the cases of Sisters Agnes H., Ruth L., and Eleanor P., all of whom were last documented in handwritten personnel rosters but never appeared in any official diocesan transfer summaries. None of these discrepancies were known to the public in the 1970s. The Catholic press continued to describe the convent in glowing, if brief, editorials. An article from the Iowa Catholic Times, dated August 1972, celebrated the deep faith and silent endurance of the Mercy Sisters, accompanied by a photograph of 6 women holding candles on the chapel steps. That image became iconic for local parishes. What the caption didn't say was that 2 of the women had not been seen again after that very week. Internally, there were efforts, restrained and poorly coordinated, to trace the missing sisters. By 1974, the convent's acting superior, Sister Carmelita, had submitted 4 incident reports to the diocesan chancellor noting non-compliance with scheduled returns, failed correspondence attempts, and confusion among personnel logs. The language remained antiseptic. None of the reports used the word missing. Nor was law enforcement ever contacted. The assumption, whether sincere or convenient, was always that the women had simply left the religious life and sought anonymity elsewhere. But this did not account for their belongings, many of which remained untouched in their quarters. Nor did it explain the silence from families. Diocesan policy at the time required written confirmation for all transitions out of religious life. In at least 6 of the 14 disappearances, no such documentation existed. Those discrepancies were noticed, but they were never acted upon. The convent's administrative patterns were defined by discretion. Files were kept in triplicate, with copies stored in separate offices within the convent, one in the superior's chamber, one in the records room near the infirmary, and one in a locked filing cabinet in the sacristy. In theory, this ensured accountability. In practice, it allowed for quiet editing. Between 1968 and 1976, the personnel rosters underwent frequent revisions. Several entries were scratched out, rewritten, or overwritten with different ink. In at least 2 cases, margins contained brief annotations such as "to be confirmed" or "pending clarification." Sister Noreen W., who had briefly served as assistant archivist before being reassigned to kitchen duty, later recounted in a private affidavit that she had been instructed not to ask about missing logbooks. She had noticed that 3 binders dated 1970, 1972, and 1975 were missing entirely from the archive shelf. When she asked Sister Lucetta, then acting as the convent's de facto office manager, she was told the pages had been reclassified due to a clerical reorganization. No one ever saw the binders again. In 1973, the diocese began its push toward centralization. Smaller convents were encouraged to consolidate their records with the Mother House in Dubuque, a move described as streamlining spiritual administration. Our Lady of Mercy complied selectively. Only liturgical calendars and non-sensitive personnel lists were sent. Medical records and housing logs remained on site, subject to internal discretion. This decision would later frustrate any attempt at external review. Sister Geraldine V., a novice stationed at the convent between 1971 and 1974, described a gradual shift in mood among the senior sisters. In her journals, which were donated anonymously to a small historical society decades later, she noted increasing seclusion within seclusion. Certain hallways in the Lower East Wing became inaccessible without keys. Meal rosters stopped, including a full head count. Novices were discouraged from asking about certain sisters by name. Geraldine recorded that when she once asked after Sister Helena M., she was told flatly, "She's at rest now." No funeral had taken place. Even within the Church's own terminology, the phrase was unusual. Rest typically referred to those who had passed, but it was always accompanied by ceremony. At Our Lady of Mercy, no death notices had been circulated. No burial plots were added to the cemetery behind the chapel during those years. Yet the sense of loss was palpable, described by Geraldine as a ghostly hush that filled the halls even in daylight. The textile workshop, once a place of shared labor and soft laughter, grew eerily quiet. Production quotas remained the same, but fewer women were seen at the looms. Sister Marjorie C., who supervised the embroidery line, began pulling novices aside for remedial instruction that often involved long silent hours in the secondary cellar. That area, which had once been used for dry goods storage, became restricted by 1975. A handwritten sign reading, "Renovation Zone Do Not Enter," was affixed to the iron gate. Though no renovations were visible from the outside, the maintenance logs from that year reflect minimal activity. A single invoice from a local contractor listed a routine boiler inspection, but nothing involving structural repair or demolition. Yet Geraldine and at least 2 other novices recalled hearing what they described as subfloor disturbances, the sound of pipes being shifted or walls being scraped at irregular hours of the night. Their attempts to inquire were dismissed as disruptive curiosity. The superior at the time, Sister Carmelita, maintained a tone of careful detachment in her communications. She held a weekly circle with senior staff, during which topics were dictated by a typed agenda. Notes from these meetings, preserved in part by a junior secretary, show no direct reference to the disappearances. Instead, the language leaned heavily on abstractions, addressing spiritual transitions, preparing for vocational re-evaluation, and preserving the sanctity of discernment. It was only in a private note, handwritten and unsigned, that the phrase involuntary departure appeared, sandwiched between a list of evening duties and a reminder about incense orders. That phrase would become central years later when former members attempted to reconstruct what had happened. But at the time it was absorbed into the ambient fog of institutional language. The ambiguity was intentional. No one could be accused of negligence if no explicit questions were asked. By 1976, the number of active residents at the convent had dropped to 32. The official explanation cited declining vocations and aging populations, but even this seemed inconsistent. Younger novices had continued to arrive through diocesan recruitment programs. The question was not why fewer joined, but why so many left with no forwarding address. A review of novitiate records from 1969 to 1975 reveals at least 9 young women who entered the convent and then disappeared from diocesan correspondence altogether. When diocesan auditors visited in March 1976, their stay was brief and uneventful. The audit notes preserved in microfilm mention a peaceful and well-ordered environment with no outstanding concerns. The visit lasted only 3 hours. No interviews were conducted with junior members. Only the superior and her assistant were consulted. It was shortly after this visit that the groundskeeper discovered the sealed pipe near the edge of the property's eastern perimeter. He reported the finding to Sister Lucetta, who recorded it as a buried irrigation relic, non-functional. The report was signed, filed, and never mentioned again. Yet the groundskeeper, in a letter to his cousin dated April 12, 1976, described the pipe in different terms. He wrote that it was cut off on both ends, filled with hard-packed soil, and not consistent with any known water line. He left his position later that year. No replacement was hired. Inside the convent, life continued in its muted rhythm. The daily schedule, matins, chores, study, vespers, remained unchanged. But there were more empty chairs, more rooms left unassigned. The silence deepened. Senior sisters referred to the gaps in attendance as quiet offerings. A phrase that once might have implied spiritual solitude now served as a cover for absence. As records were slowly revised and rooms reassigned, the memory of the missing women faded into a kind of institutional amnesia. The youngest novices were told only what was necessary. Many did not even know the names of those who had come before them. Sister Geraldine left the convent in late 1976, officially cited as incompatible with communal life. She would later describe her departure as an escape. Of the 14 missing nuns, no full investigation was ever launched. No centralized inquiry connected the disappearances into a single pattern. Each was treated as an isolated case, quietly filed and never pursued. In September 1976, 6 months after the audit, and 3 months after the groundskeeper's departure, the diocese received a letter postmarked from Burlington, Iowa. It was addressed to the Chancellor's office, but marked with no return name. The handwriting was steady, measured, and unsigned. It read simply, "The absence is not voluntary. They are not returned. Look below the old cruciform garden." The note was archived under miscellaneous correspondence and filed without follow-up. The cruciform garden referred to an area behind the convent's chapel, once landscaped in the shape of a cross with alternating rows of lilac and dogwood. By the early 1970s, the design had fallen into disrepair. Overgrowth and weather erosion blurred the outline. Novices occasionally pruned the outer rows, but the central section was no longer maintained. A wooden trellis, once the centerpiece, had collapsed and was quietly removed in 1972. No plans were made to restore it. It was within this same overgrown area that Sister Irene L., then 63 and partially retired from active duty, began keeping a private log. She had arrived at the convent in 1950 and had served as both infirmary attendant and sacristan. Though regarded as eccentric, she was trusted enough to oversee storage keys and linen inventories. Her notebooks, discovered decades later in a sealed drawer, recorded dates, initials, and short observations. Many of the entries are brief. MJ not at supper, room dark, or new bedding removed from 4B, no reassignment logged. Her last entry, dated August 5, 1976, simply reads, "The garden no longer receives sun." Sister Irene's notes did not name any accuser. They presented no clear narrative, but the accumulation of small irregularities spread across her 3 volumes formed a quiet record of vanishing presences. She never left the convent. She died in 1979 and was buried on site. No one reviewed her notebooks until 1998, when a local archivist cataloguing donation materials found them hidden among surplus choir books. Ignored signs were often quiet ones. In the absence of alarm, the convent operated as though nothing had changed. Yet those who paid attention noticed patterns. Visitors, for instance, were quietly restricted beginning in 1971. Prior to that year, families were invited to attend liturgical holidays, especially Holy Week and All Saints' Day. Overnight stays were rare, but permitted under supervision. Starting in late 1971, this changed. A memo from Sister Carmelita to diocesan communications marked the shift. All external hospitality shall now require written approval to preserve spiritual integrity. The phrase was vague, but the outcome was clear. No family stayed overnight again. This policy change coincided with the unrecorded departure of Sister Martha G., a novice from Ottumwa, who had been at the convent less than a year. Her family reportedly received a letter stating she had discerned out of her vocation and was pursuing studies. No such enrollment could be verified. The address provided led to an empty lot. When her parents inquired further, they received no reply. The bishop's office acknowledged receipt of their request, but cited privacy concerns. That correspondence, now archived, contains the phrase, "It is our understanding she no longer wishes contact." The same phrasing appears in 5 other cases. Always the same sentence structure, always the same passive implication, someone else understands on her behalf. None of the families received phone calls, none were invited to collect personal belongings. Ignored signs were also embedded in the physical layout. By 1975, several rooms in the lower east wing had their doorknobs removed and replaced with keyed latches. Officially, this was to ensure safety during overnight care, but resident logs show no indication of patients requiring such containment. The sisters who lived in those rooms were ambulatory and independent. When questioned internally, Sister Lucetta responded that the doors reflected evolving standards of discretion. No further explanation was given. Laundry staff noted changes as well. Sheets from certain rooms were marked with an alternate laundering code, not logged in the standard rotation. Instead of going through the communal wash area, they were hand-washed in a separate basin in the basement scullery. Novices assigned to help were rotated frequently. One such novice, Sister Alana R., later recalled in oral testimony that the linens from that rotation carried a different scent, like copper and lye. She said she was told never to discuss it. There were also changes in mealtime seating. The communal dining space, once arranged with long wooden tables, was quietly divided by mobile partitions in early 1974. Seating assignments became fixed, and senior sisters were positioned so as to block view of certain hallway doors. Those who were absent were not acknowledged aloud. The evening blessing remained unchanged, but Sister Geraldine, still a resident at the time, described a noticeable thinning in the line to the bread table. Her journal for March 22, 1974 reads, 7 loaves prepared, only 5 consumed. A visiting postulant from Wisconsin, who stayed for 3 weeks in the summer of 1975, noted in her application rejection that portions of the convent felt unused, though footsteps were heard in rooms, believed to be empty. She later entered a different religious order and did not return. Her report was never followed up. None of these accounts on their own carried force. The sisters were trained in restraint, and their roles demanded silence. Concern was not expressed as confrontation. It was logged quietly, filed softly, or held inward. The environment did not support alarm. It supported perseverance. One of the few external records that hints at irregularity came from the postal carrier, who serviced the convent between 1970 and 1977. In a casual comment recorded during a federal postal route review, he noted, "A large amount of mail marked return to sender, addressed to names not on the current roster." He wrote, "Approximately 3 per month, usually with handwritten corrections and no forwarding address." His comment was not pursued, as the convent was a religious institution and therefore accorded discretionary privacy under postal guidelines. By the end of 1976, the diocese internally downgraded Our Lady of Mercy's classification from active novitiate to contemplative residency. This shift was never announced publicly. It simply changed the language in a few line items. Recruitment materials no longer listed the convent as a destination for postulants. Placement for new novices ceased. The convent became a closed loop, sustaining only those already within its walls. This internal closure coincided with the sudden reassignment of Sister Carmelita to a rural mission in Minnesota. No explanation was given. Her replacement, Sister Agnes Mary, was younger, less connected to the institution's history, and known for her compliance. Within months, she issued a circular declaring a new era of contemplative renewal. All previous logs were boxed and transferred to the attic storage. The lower wings were sealed for seasonal maintenance. Those closures were never reversed. The eastern corridor was never reopened. The cruciform garden was flattened and seeded with lawn. The convent entered a prolonged stillness that would last nearly 2 decades. One of the earliest private attempts to document the missing nuns came from a former resident named Sister Thomasina, who left Our Lady of Mercy in 1975 under what the diocese labeled medical exemption. Her health had declined, but her mental clarity remained intact. She returned to live with extended family in Cedar Rapids and began writing a series of personal letters to former acquaintances. None of the letters were mailed. They were discovered in her effects after her passing in 1988, bundled in twine and marked with the words "Not for public record." The letters themselves were confessional in tone, but restrained in content. In them, Sister Thomasina refers to silent absences and vanished presences among the women she once considered spiritual companions. One letter, addressed to a former postulant named Mary Jo, contains the line, "I do not believe they all left freely. There were too many meals without laughter, too many rooms prepared and then quietly locked." She does not assign blame. Instead, she circles around the institutional reluctance to acknowledge loss, framing it as a failure of charity rather than a conspiracy. The letters do not name individuals, but they include dates and phrases that align closely with known departure gaps. A particularly striking entry from April 1974 refers to a morning when the convent bell failed to ring at its scheduled hour. "The silence was not broken until Mass," she wrote. "And when it was, there were only 4 voices in the choir loft. I remember that because we needed 6 to sing the psalm properly." Elsewhere, ignored signs emerged not through words, but through sound. Several former novices recalled a persistent, low mechanical hum emanating from the southern corridor of the Lower East Wing, beginning sometime in late 1972. They were told it was part of a new heating unit. Yet no installation records exist, and no temperature adjustments were noted in the maintenance logs. The hum continued into early 1976 and then abruptly stopped. Sister Alana, one of the last novices to remain before the convent's transition, later described the sound in an oral history project. "It was always there when you passed the laundry chute. Not loud, just enough to let you know something was alive behind the wall. And then one day it was gone." The moment of silence, rather than the hum itself, lingered with her. It felt like the wall had exhaled. Her testimony, recorded on cassette in 1993, was never distributed. It remains in a closed archive at a university library, indexed under anonymous collection due to diocesan sensitivity. Ignored signs also manifested in inconsistencies between inventories. A detailed review of linen supply reports between 1971 and 1976 shows a consistent order pattern that does not align with official occupancy. Each month, the convent ordered 45 sets of linens, yet internal rosters during those years never recorded more than 38 occupants. When questioned in a later review, Sister Agnes Mary explained the surplus as for visitors and seasonal clergy. However, no record exists of any extended clergy visitation during those years. The same discrepancy appears in the convent's food provisioning. Bulk flour, legumes, and dried milk continued to be delivered in quantities aligned with a population of at least 50. Some of the surplus was quietly donated to local shelters, but not in sufficient amounts to account for the difference. Kitchen staff were rotated too frequently to establish consistent oversight, and none were able to confirm exactly how many portions were served each day. As one former assistant put it, "We cooked for numbers that never sat down." The architecture itself reflected silent decisions. In late 1973, 2 original stained glass windows were removed from the east chapel wall and replaced with frosted privacy panels. The explanation was structural weather damage, yet the removed panels were not sent for repair, nor were they archived. They simply vanished. No photographs exist of their design, and their absence altered the light inside the sanctuary. What had once been a room of soft color became filled with a diffused whiteness. Several sisters described the shift as disorienting. Sister Ruth Ann, who remained at the convent into the 1980s, recalled in her memoirs the quiet reaction to the window change. It was never spoken of, but when the morning liturgy began that week, no one sang the entrance hymn. We all just stood. Her book was privately printed and omitted the name of the convent, referring only to a retreat house in the River Hills. Those memoirs also mention a locked cabinet behind the sacristy wall, containing what she called the unasked questions. She never elaborated on what it held, but her writing suggests an awareness of selective memory as a form of institutional preservation. "We did not forget," she wrote. "We were instructed not to remember." By the time the diocese reassigned oversight of the convent to a regional administrator in 1977, much of the physical evidence had been reorganized or removed. Rooms once used for individual quarters were converted to communal meditation spaces. Any personal markings or belongings had been cleared. Photographs were consolidated into a single hallway display, eliminating dates and names. Even the cemetery records were simplified, listing only initials and years of death. The garden behind the chapel was reseeded with low-maintenance grass. The trellis was never replaced. What had once been a vibrant cross-shaped pattern of blooms became an indistinct field bordered by hedges. Sister Alana, in a later interview, said she stopped walking past it entirely. It felt like the earth was refusing to speak. Throughout this period, diocesan oversight remained surface level. Inspection forms continued to list the convent as compliant, with notes such as peaceful atmosphere and no grievances reported. No mention was ever made of the missing sisters. The institution's silence became its shield. In the absence of accusation, no defense was required. A visiting liturgical consultant, brought in for a chapel redesign in 1978, noted in his private diary a sense of unease. The air is clear, but something remains unsettled. There are gaps in the architecture, not of stone, but of presence. His comment was never published. The consultant left after one day. In the spring of 1992, a renovation grant was issued to several aging diocesan properties, including the Our Lady of Mercy Convent. Though the building had functioned at reduced capacity for nearly 15 years, the grounds remained structurally intact, and the diocese intended to repurpose it as a spiritual retreat center. The project was modest in scope: electrical rewiring, foundation stabilization, and updated plumbing. What the grant proposal did not anticipate was that the repairs would uncover structural anomalies beneath the eastern wing, long sealed and unofficially removed from the convent's internal maps. The contractors, led by a firm based out of Des Moines, were instructed to access the subfloor crawl spaces to inspect drainage. What they found were remnants of a corridor no longer visible from inside the building. Cemented shut at both ends, The passage was not listed on any blueprints. Its tile was faded, mismatched, and partially covered in silt. The walls bore traces of water damage, though no pipework ran through them. At its midpoint, the corridor narrowed abruptly, leading to a sealed iron door with a corroded hinge and no visible handle. The workers documented the find with standard photographs and logged the discovery in their weekly progress report. Within a week, a diocesan facilities manager arrived unannounced and instructed the crew to refocus on the main stairwell renovations. No further excavation of the corridor was permitted. The area was resealed, this time with reinforced concrete, and excluded from all future project documentation. One of the workers, who later spoke under condition of anonymity, retained a copy of the corridor photograph. He shared it in 2007 with a local historical researcher named Edward Harlan, who had been compiling oral histories from former sisters and regional clergy. Harlan immediately recognized the location as aligning with the undocumented service hall that had been rumored by multiple interviewees. Most notably, Sister Alana had referenced a disused spine beneath the old infirmary that once led to auxiliary storage but was closed after the reassignments. Harlan began cross-referencing convent floor plans from the 1940s and 1950s. Earlier blueprints, archived at the Diocesan Mother House in Dubuque, clearly indicated an eastern service passage running parallel to the main laundry chute. The corridor was labeled as interior egress, likely used for utility transport and linen carts. But beginning in 1967, the layout changed. The passage was omitted entirely. No demolition permits had been filed. No closure was formally recorded. Around this time, Harlan also gained access to fragments of maintenance ledgers preserved by a retired facilities supervisor. Among the entries was a 1973 notation reading, "Lower East Hallway Junction walled per D instruction. No circulation." The identity of D was not specified. No cost breakdown accompanied the note, implying the work was done internally without external contractors. This aligned with the testimony of Sister Ruth Ann, who had mentioned in her memoirs a period in which the hammering beneath the floor was constant, though never acknowledged. She had interpreted the sounds as pipe adjustments. No one had told her that a corridor was being erased. As Harlan continued his research, he began corresponding with the small historical society in Keokuk that had preserved materials donated by Sister Geraldine. Among the items was an unmarked envelope containing a single inventory sheet, dated July 1975. The sheet listed room assignments in the Lower East Wing, using initials rather than full names. 13 rooms were noted. 7 included notations such as temporary assignment, closed for refit, or no access. The document had no official stamp, but was written in the same hand as Sister Lucetta's known correspondence. It was the last line that unsettled Harlan. Room 4C. Sealed indefinitely. No explanation. No accompanying initials. Just the phrase alone at the bottom of the page. Efforts to revisit the site formally were unsuccessful. The diocese had already sold portions of the convent land to private developers, and access was restricted. Harlan's requests to view internal diocesan files were denied on the grounds of privacy, citing the sanctity of spiritual communities. No legal mechanism allowed further review, but the oral record was growing. By 1995, 4 former residents had independently confirmed that they remembered the Eastern Corridor. Each recalled a period during which it had become off-limits or under repair. Sister Thomasina's letters were referenced again, particularly her remark. They bricked up not just the walls but the memory. None of the women could describe a specific event that triggered the closure. It had simply happened, gradually, and then completely. Meanwhile, back at the convent, only 5 sisters remained. The building operated quietly as a rest home for retired clergy, with no active novitiate or public ministry. The chapel was maintained, but masses were infrequent. The stained glass had not been restored. The garden, now little more than an open lawn, received annual trimming but no further cultivation. It was in this quiet landscape that one of the last surviving residents, Sister Philomena, began speaking with Edward Harlan. Their first meeting was arranged by a mutual acquaintance and took place in the convent's former sewing room, now repurposed as a reading parlor. She was in her late 70s, soft-spoken and hesitant, but over time she permitted Harlan to record their conversations, provided the tapes would remain sealed until her death. In one of the final sessions, she described a night in 1972 when she was called to assist in the infirmary after hours. A sister had fallen, though no name was given. When she arrived, the hallway was dimly lit and a linen cart had been overturned near the stairwell. She was instructed not to touch anything and was sent back to her room. The next day, she noticed that Sister Marianne's door was ajar, her belongings gone. No mention was made at morning liturgy. She never saw Sister Marianne again. When asked if she believed the event was connected to the other disappearances, Sister Philomena answered only, "I believe there are chapters of our story that were written in ink not meant for reading." The tapes, now transcribed and held under restricted access, contain no allegations, no accusations, just silence and the occasional sound of bird song through the open window. The discovery of the sealed corridor, coupled with the testimonies and misaligned inventories, prompted Harlan to make a final attempt at formal recognition of the case. In 1998, he submitted a private dossier to the Regional Historical Commission, framing his findings as a heritage preservation concern. He included architectural inconsistencies, excerpts from Sister Irene's notebooks, photographs of the corridor, and redacted transcripts from his conversations with Sister Philomena. He did not accuse. He simply asked for the area to be studied before renovations erased the remaining trace of a structure no longer acknowledged in blueprints. The Commission responded within 2 months, citing a lack of jurisdiction over ecclesiastical properties. The land, though formerly under diocesan care, was now partially in private hands and partially under a trust administered by the Sisters of St. Margaret. Without a directive from the diocese itself, no external historical study could be authorized. The letter closed with a polite refusal and a note of appreciation for Harlan's interest in preserving Iowa's spiritual history. He would make no further appeals. That same year, Sister Alana passed away in a care facility outside Davenport. Her personal papers were left to a cousin, who later donated them to a Catholic college archive. Among the folders was a sheet titled Fall Retreat 1974, Revised Meal Prep, listing the number of servings per mealtime. That document, like so many others, revealed a discrepancy. 44 servings were planned for a group that, by all available records, never exceeded 33 residents at the time. There was no annotation, no explanation, just a surplus of meals served to no visible guests. As the convent grounds continued their slow transition into silence, physical traces of its previous life receded. The central bell, once used to mark the hours of prayer, had been decommissioned. Its internal mechanism was removed and replaced with a decorative bracket. The eastern staircase, which had been stripped of carpet and rails, was boarded at its midpoint. Most notably, the iron gate leading to the garden path behind the chapel was locked for good. Only staff with a specific brass key could access it. The reason given was soil instability, though no geological assessments had ever been conducted. Among the final efforts to preserve institutional memory was a small publication funded by the diocese in 2001, titled Lives of Quiet Devotion, The Mercy Sisters of River County. The booklet included brief biographies, selected photographs, and excerpts from liturgical poetry. There were no mentions of disappearances, no hint of discrepancy. It included a list of sisters who had passed while in residence, with years of death ranging from 1951 to 1985. 13 names commonly cited by former residents were absent. The editor, when asked, said those names had no confirmable exit data. That phrase was echoed in internal correspondence uncovered later through a private researcher's request. A memorandum from 1977 between diocesan archivists included the line, "Where exit cannot be verified and no contact re-established, record as non-confirmable and exclude from listing." In effect, absence had become its own form of classification, not lost, not deceased, simply omitted. Even within the cemetery grounds, subtle omissions could be read. Rows of identical markers, each bearing a sister's religious name and date of profession, stood in quiet alignment. But certain years bore no corresponding burials. For the span between 1967 and 1976, only 2 new headstones were added. One was for Sister Irene, the other for a novice named Clara J., whose records were intact. The others, if they had passed, were not buried on site, and if they had left, no trace of them remained in diocesan channels, civic registries, or family correspondence. The absence of finality made investigation difficult. There were no death certificates, no transfer documents, no medical releases. The standard closure mechanisms, civil, clerical, and familial, had all been bypassed by the same institutional silence. In 2003, Harlan published a limited-run monograph through a university press. It was titled Rooms Unnamed, Institutional Memory and the Boundaries of Loss. The book used the Convent case as a broader exploration of how organizations manage unacknowledged departures. It did not name the convent directly, referring instead to a Midwestern novitiate between 1965 and 1976. For the text was clinical, grounded in archival method and architectural analysis. It received modest academic attention, but did not provoke public inquiry. That same year, a new building permit was filed for partial demolition of the southern storage annex. The permit included the note, "Previously unused corridor to be removed and filled." Though the permit was public, the referenced corridor was not visible on any published maps. Its removal was noted in the contractor's ledger as complete by late autumn. No photographs were retained. No debris was listed as recovered. Shortly after, Sister Philomena entered hospice care. She declined further interviews. In her final days, she asked for 2 visitors only, a former postulant and Edward Harlan. The latter visit was brief. She thanked him for listening. Then, as he was leaving, she handed him a sealed envelope marked simply with the words, "In case they ever ask." The envelope contained no confession, no map, only a list. 14 names, each with a date, each with a room number. Sister Eleanor P., 3B, April 1966. Sister Agnes H., 2A, July 1967. Sister Ruth L., 5D, November 1968. Sister Martha G., 1C, March 1970. Sister Marianne J., 2C, October 1972. Sister Helena M., 4H, May 1973. Sister Clara J., 6B, June 1973. Sister Althea R., 3C, January 1974. Sister Joanne L., 5A, September 1974. Sister Linda M., 2D, January 1975. Sister Veronica F., 1D, June 1975. Sister Margaret W., 4C, August 1975. Sister Frances E., 6C, February 1976. Sister Juliana T., 5B, April 1976. No cause, no annotation. Only the names, the rooms, and the dates they were last seen. When asked what the list meant, Sister Philomena replied only, "I was told not to write it, so I memorized it, and when I couldn't keep it anymore, I let it go." She died 3 days later. By 2010, the former Our Lady of Mercy Convent was known publicly only as the Mercy Renewal Center. Its signage, recently updated, described it as a non-residential site for seasonal reflection and ecological education. The building's original purpose was not erased, but neither was it acknowledged. Visitors arrived for silent retreats or weekend workshops. Most were unaware that the wings now labeled Reflection Hall and Meditation South had once housed the infirmary and sleeping quarters. The garden, now advertised as a nature trail, bore no markers of its former shape. At the far edge of the lawn where the trellis once stood, a small bench was installed facing east. Its plaque read, "For all who walked in silence." No date, no attribution, just a sentence that, for most who saw it, blended into the quiet. Legacy, in the case of Our Lady of Mercy, was curated not through memorials but through redirection. The convent had left behind few visible scars. Its paper trail was incomplete. Its personnel files remained under religious privilege. The architecture had been partially reconfigured, the most troubling spaces walled or renamed. What remained was a narrative of soft service, a place where older women had lived out their days in prayer, where novices once came to learn humility, and where the seasons now passed without incident. Yet for a small circle of researchers and former residents, that legacy remained unfinished. In 2012, Edward Harlan retired from teaching and donated, a network error occurred. Please check your connection and try again. If this issue persists, please contact us through our help center at help.openai.com. Repetir. The final disposition of Our Lady of Mercy Convent came not through decree but through vacancy. By 2008, only 2 sisters remained on the grounds. They resided in the West Annex, now retrofitted as a residence wing, with medical staff visiting weekly. The rest of the property stood quiet. Most of the original spaces had been cleared of contents: the sacristy, the sewing room, the novitiate dormitories, all stripped of furnishings marked with placards indicating their former use. A bronze plaque near the chapel entrance read, "In Devoted Service, 1893-2001. That final year, 2001, was not tied to a specific event. There had been no fire, no closure announcement, simply a date chosen to close the ledger. The convent became a reference rather than a location. Its name was used on letterhead, but no longer referred to a physical house. Retreats were cancelled, vows were received elsewhere. When the remaining sisters relocated in 2009, the convent was formally decommissioned. A private trust assumed ownership of the land. The building was neither razed nor restored. It remained in a kind of suspended quiet, watched over by a property manager and visited occasionally by surveyors. The chapel was locked, the grounds unmarked. Yet legacy, like water, finds its level. The silence surrounding the 14 names did not remain complete. By 2012, enough documentation had surfaced through independent researchers and diocesan fragments to merit interest from outside observers. A regional journalist, Elise Danner, working on a documentary series about underdocumented religious institutions, requested access to the property. She was denied entry but allowed to interview a representative of the trust. The interview, conducted off-camera, provided little detail. The representative emphasized the privacy of the sisters' spiritual lives and the sanctity of cloistered records. When asked about the sealed corridor, he replied, "The structure was no longer sound. It posed a liability." No mention was made of what had once been within. Elise's resulting segment aired on regional public television as part of a broader piece on faith and isolation. It included an exterior shot of the convent, distant and quiet under overcast skies. The narration referenced a community once full, now vanished. She did not speculate. She let the image speak. Still, viewers called in, some with memories, some with names. A former nurse, now retired, recognized the chapel window from her brief assignment in 1974. A local carpenter recalled installing a partition wall at the convent in the mid-70s and being told not to ask what lay behind it. A family in Burlington wrote that their cousin, Sister Juliana, had joined the convent in 1975 and was never heard from again. None of these leads could be formally verified. The diocesan archivist at the time, in a letter to Danner's producer, wrote that many records of the era are incomplete due to clerical reorganization. The letter concluded with thanks and a request for prayers. The story did not gain national traction. It never became scandal. There were no lawsuits, no televised inquiries, but within a small network of former residents, researchers, and local clergy, the record remained open. Private correspondence grew. More lists emerged, not always matching. Some included alternate dates, others included initials not found elsewhere, but the core was consistent: a group of women affiliated with a convent, absent without closure. In 2015, Edward Harlan passed away. His papers were donated as per his will to a regional university archive. The files were boxed carefully, redacted where necessary, and sealed with restricted access for 20 years. Yet among the materials was a handwritten summary of his findings, composed late in his life. In it, he reflected not on evidence, but on absence. He wrote, "What remains is not the need to prove, but the need to remember. A door was sealed, a hallway walled, but the memory of those who once walked it cannot be erased by concrete." That line became the epigraph to a small memorial article published in a local diocesan newsletter. The article did not mention the convent directly. It referred to those who served quietly and whose quiet was never broken. No formal inquiry followed. The grounds of the convent were sold in parcels beginning in 2017. The main building, considered unsuitable for habitation, was left intact but unused. A historical marker, installed discreetly by the local historical society, stood at the edge of the property. It bore no names. It read simply, "Site of Our Lady of Mercy Convent, 1893 to 2001, House of Prayer, Place of Silence." A year later, in the fall of 2018, an anonymous envelope arrived at the diocesan archive. Inside was a photocopy of Sister Philomena's list. The original was still sealed in Harlan's collection. This second version bore no return address and no signature. It included one addition. Beneath the 14th name, another had been written by hand. Sister Philomena R. 3D, October 2009. The archivist did not add the name to the registry. He filed the list under unauthenticated materials. It was indexed, stored, and left untouched, and so the legacy of the convent passed into a space beyond visibility. It remained not in memorials, not in formal recognition, but in the private recollections of those who had seen gaps where no explanation followed. The story survived in the empty rooms, the resealed doors, the meals served to no guest. It persisted, not in answers but in the quiet insistence that someone had once been there. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering.